Now let's set in the sleeve. Find your underarm seam, or your side seam, and your underarm seam on your sleeve. Okay, so I'm going to match up the side seam of my blouse with the underarm seam of my sleeve. I'm putting right sides together, and I'm working from the inside of the blouse. Okay, put a pin in, and then you're going to work up one side. Okay, so I'm matching up my directional notches. So if it's the front, I have one notch. If it's the back, I have two, and I'll put a pin in there. And then go to the other side and work up to your directional notches. You can see it's two notches, it's my back. And put a pin in there. And now I'm going to find my shoulder seam. I'm going to line up the notch that's at the top of my sleeve cap with my shoulder seam. And then put a pin in there. And now I'm going to keep working up for my directional notches until I get to my ease notches. Alright, now if the ease notch on your sleeve does not match up perfectly with the ease notch on your blouse, that's okay as long as it's close. Alright, and just pick a point where you pick one of the notches, either the one on your sleeve or the one on your blouse. That's where you'll put the pin in and you'll start gathering it. So go ahead and match that. And now, remember, you're going to be gathering between your ease notch and the top of the cap. Okay, this is just like we did in our setting in the sleeve demo. So pull those gathers shorter than you need them, and then spread them out to the width of the sleeve on the blouse, the sleeve hole, the armhole on the blouse that you're trying to match them to. Then you're going to spread those gathers out in between the top of the cap and the notch, the gathering, the ease notch. And then once you have them gathered evenly, go ahead and pin them in place. Again, this is just like when we gathered, or we did the demo for setting in our sleeve, the exact same thing. So if you did that and did it well, then this will not be an issue. So once you finish one side, go to the next side. And remember to put a pin in right where you're gathering stitches. The tails of the stitches come out so you can wrap them and anchor them down. And then pull them smaller, spread them back out to the side, the size that you need them to be. And then anchor those threads around the pin, put in place to hold them, and then even those gathers out. Alright, so now that our sleeve is pinned in place, we can go to the sewing machine. Now you're going to start sewing at your underarm or your side seam. I like to start just a little beyond it, and you're going to stitch it on at a 1/2 inch. When you stitch, make sure the bodice or the blouse side is against the sewing machine, and then the sleeve side, the side with the gathers, is up against the presser foot. And be careful to stitch it on a 1/2 inch. And if you need to sew over your pins, you may, but be very careful. Walk it over walk the foot over the pins, go very slowly, all right? And you may need to adjust your ease a little bit as you go, and that's fine. So just go slow. On sleeves, because you're sewing a circle, the blouse kind of gets turned around and tangled. So you should be moving, unwrapping it as you go. You'll have to be turning it, and it's easy to get gathers and tucks and get things underneath the foot. So make sure you're adjusting for all that and that it's not getting caught under there. And you might have to be smoothing out the bodice side as you go. All right, once both your sleeves are stitched on, you're going to check it. So once you've clipped the thread so it's released from the machine, take out any extra pins that you might have in it, and then check it and make sure that nothing got folded underneath and stitched into the seam that shouldn't be there, that there's no tucks or really large amounts of gathers in one area. Okay, it should be pretty even. And here it is. You can see the blouse with both sleeves now stitched onto it. The pattern works good, so they go in pretty well. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to trim our seam allowance and our armhole back to 1/4 of an inch. So you have a 1/2 inch seam allowance there, so you'll trim off 1/4 of an inch. Because what we'll do here is like we did on the waist seam, in the back of their blouse where the gathered section was stitched to the section with the 2 darts, we bias bound that. All right, so we're going to bias bind our armholes as well. So go ahead and continue trimming that 1/4 of an inch. Your seam allowance down to 1/4 of an inch, but then you're going to need that bias binding that we've created at the beginning, that I showed you how to create at the beginning of this process, because we'll be using that in here to finish off the armhole. Alright, so take your bias binding and you're going to put it on the side with the sleeve and fold under about a 1/2 inch of bias binding. Alright, so here it is, the side of the sleeve. I'm going to start it a little beyond the armhole. See, notice I'm folding under 1/2 inch. Okay, and notice, and that finishes off that edge, so when it wraps around it will be finished. Okay, so there we go. And you're lining up the cut edge of the bias binding with the cut edge of the sleeve, or with the armhole. Okay, cut edge of bias binding with cut edge of armhole. And now I'm going to stitch that on at 1/4 of an inch, or exactly on the same stitches or stitching line as I used to stitch on my sleeve. Okay, so just follow your stitching line. If you go into the seam allowance a little bit, no big deal, but you do not want to go in to the garment, because in your sleeve you'll be taking more seam allowance and it will the sleeve won't function correctly. So as you go, just make sure you're lining up the bias binding, cut edge of the bias binding with the cut edge of the armhole, and you're stitching it on right on the same stitching line that you stitch your sleeve in. Okay, go slow and it will go on very nicely. And then you're going to overlap it. When you come back around to the other side where you began, you're going to overlap it by about 1/2 inch to an inch, which you'll see here momentarily. Okay, so that's where I began. You can see my bias binding folded under where I'm clipping those threads. And I'm going to continue stitching. I'm going to go see a little further over, just like that. Okay, now Remember at the beginning we folded under our bias binding. We do not need to do this coming back around. We're just going to stitch it a little past where we folded under, about an inch, half inch to an inch. Okay, back tack. And then we'll just cut it straight across the part that's hanging off that we didn't stitch. There we go. Now what's going to happen is this is going to fold out. Check your sleeve and make sure you didn't catch anything when you sewed that on. Looks good, nothing's been caught. Okay, so now what's going to happen is the bias binding is going to roll around to the inside here, around that seam, and enclose it and give it a nice finish. And we're going to hand tack this down with a hidden slip stitch. So roll those around the other side, like so. Bias binding, roll it down around the exposed seam. And then we'll do a hidden slip stitch here, catching it down. Okay. The needle, what's going to happen is the needle is going to travel through the crease of the bias binding. All right. The needle will travel through the crease, and you'll come out and you'll catch right on the seam allowance of the armhole. Don't go past the seam allowance. Okay, you'll see the stitching line of where you stitched the sleeve to the garment. Okay, you don't want to go past that. You can go right into that stitching line, but don't go past it into the garment. You want to stay either in the seam allowance or right on that stitching line. Okay, I always try to get as close to the stitching line as possible. All right, so again, the needle will travel through the bias binding, the crease of the bias binding, and then you'll just catch a little bit of that seam allowance and then go right back into the bias binding, travel through that crease for about a 3/8 to a half an inch, and do that all the way around. Okay. The needle I'm using here is a little too big. I'd prefer a smaller one, but it will get the job done. All right, once you get all the way around, go ahead and tie off and cut your thread. And you're doing this to both armholes. So once you've finished, you've set in both your sleeves and clean finish both your armholes. It's a nice clean finish. So all we have left to do is do the handwork on the yoke and your blouse will be complete.